Hello, Merlin.
Hi.
Welcome. Welcome. There is a lot I want to discuss with you, a lot, but we probably won't have enough time to do all of that. We only have about 20 minutes. I thought it would make sense to start with a little bit of terminology. Only thing I really know is mushroom, but there's to have a intelligent conversation about fungi, it involves a little bit of terminology definitions. So could you help us with that?
Well,
Fungi. What are fungi and what are mushrooms? Perhaps that connects
hmm.
with one another.
So fungi is the name for fungi is the plural of fungus.
Okay.
A fungi is a kingdom of life. So that's as broad a category as animals or plants. There are lots of ways to be a fungus, just as there are lots of ways to be an animal and lots of ways to be a plant. Mushrooms are the reproductive structures produced by some types of fungi. And not all types. A small minority of fungi produce mushrooms. And they're analogous to fruits on a plant. They're the ways that fungi are able to disperse their spores. And spores are rather like seeds on a plant. They are a propagule, a little particle of fungal life that can go elsewhere and turn into a new fungus.
Okay.
And so most fungi don't live most of their lives as mushrooms. Most fungi live most of their lives as mycelium. And mycelium is the name given to branching, fusing networks of tubular cells, which is how fungi feed. They grow into their food. They put their bodies into the food rather than put food into their bodies as we do. And mycelial networks are made up of fungal cells, and these tubular cells are called hyphae.
Okay.
And so the hyphae tangle together, branch and fuse together into mycelial networks.
Okay, and then there's the last term that I think is really interesting is mycorrhizal. Am I pronouncing that right?
That's right, mycorrhizal. And this is a name of a lifestyle of some types of fungi which live with plants, and they grow in and around plant roots, and they emanate out into the soil, and they exist in trading relationships with plants. And the word mycorrhizal means root fungus. Myco, fungus, and rhiza, root.
Now, one of the things that I found really interesting reading your book and sort of researching towards this conversation was that mushrooms themselves are indeed the fruit, but only a very small visible part of the fungi as such. Could you explain a little bit like how much fungi is there actually on Earth? If mushrooms aren't necessarily an indication of fungi, like how much of fungi exists?
So recent estimates suggest there could be as many as 6 million species of fungi, which means that only 7% of the fungal kingdom have been described by humans, which leaves over 90% of fungal life unknown to us. And so obviously this is a good way to summarize our ignorance about the fungal world. Yeah.
And one of the things I always found interesting is what these partitions, these sort of categories of kingdoms, right? So you have animal kingdom, you have the plant kingdom, and I'm kind of interested in what makes a kingdom, I guess, and also what makes fungi a separate kingdom than, say, the plant kingdom.
So kingdom is just a level of hierarchical organization in the modern scientific system of taxonomy, and there are a number of other levels, and kingdom is just a level, quite a high up level, a high level at which organisms are divided. Fungi are different from animals and plants in a few ways. Plants photosynthesize. They have a green color, and they make their energy from light and carbon dioxide in the air. Fungi don't do this. They're more like animals. They have to find food ready-made and then digest it. But they are one of the things that characterizes them is they produce, they grow they grow in a certain way from their tip. They elongate from their tip if they're mycelial fungi, and they build their cell walls out of a tough compound called chitin, which is characteristic of all fungi. So they are eukaryotes in the sense that they are like animals and plants. They're eukaryotes. They have cellular subdivision, like we do, like plants do. They are heterotrophic,
Okay.
like animals and
Okay.
unlike plants, which means they have to find that energy in the world and then eat it, and they produce chitin. They build their cell walls out of chitin.
Okay. Okay, that I'm hoping everybody now understands what fungi are, and I commend you at the sheer incredible ability to explain very complex terms in very accessible ways. So thank you for that. But one thing I'm a little bit sort of been wondering, and I think a lot of people are kind of, there's this idea now that we're coming to a complete reappreciation of what fungi are and do in the world for life as such. I've heard, and maybe you can correct me on this, I've heard that literally life would not have been possible without fungi. That's a new kind of concept of realization. Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Mm-hmm.
What did we think before? And what have we learned? And what do we suspect now?
So I should add that there have been many gifted fungal researchers over the years, over the decades, and even centuries, many of whom have known and understood quite how important fungi are to the living world. And what we're seeing now is a more of this understanding leaking into a popular consciousness. But for many people who have been thinking about this and who've been fascinated and impressed by fungi, much of this is not news. But it's a welcome change that this is the fungi are starting to be acknowledged and appreciated, and people are taking an interest in them. But there are new things we're finding out about fungi. Fungi are neglected by modern scientists, have been for a while, and so there are new discoveries about fungi and what fungi do that are broadening, deepening, and expanding our understanding of the living world. And one example of this, there are quite a few, but one I find very compelling is the idea that the ancestors of plants, these algae which existed in fresh water and lakes and rivers, they had to partner with fungi in order to start making their way onto land. So the ancestors of plants would have been little puddles of photosynthetic tissue, and when they started washing up on the soggy shores of these bodies of water, they would have needed to start exploring the soil for their nutrients rather than just absorbing it from the broth that they were floating in. And to explore the soil is a whole new kind of challenge which requires new abilities. Fungi are brilliant at that kind of exploration. And so it seems that at this early stage, about 500 million years ago, fungi started to grow in and around this algal tissue and behaved as their root systems for tens of millions of years until plants could evolve their own roots. So really roots follow fungi into being, and the entire lineage of land plants within which we live and within which we are embedded and without which we couldn't have evolved, the whole lineage of land plants is a story of fungal collaboration and fungal relationships, and that what we call plants are fungi that have evolved to farm algae and algae that have evolved to farm fungi. And so just this kind of understanding really changes, I think, a lot of the way that we think about the world in which we live.
And soil. There's a whole thing about how fungi make soil possible, right? From stone to soil. Is that a correct? Could you explain that a little bit? The science behind that.
So soil comes about from a number of from a number of different directions. But one way that's a key process in the formation of soil is the digestion of rock, the mineralization of rock. And fungi play important roles in doing this. They're able to produce acids and chemicals that bind to minerals. And they can essentially eat rock, at least a number of them can. And so this brings this mineral matter from rocks over into the metabolic cycles of the living. Lichens do this, these symbiotic organisms, which are part fungus, but also other fungi do it. And I've seen these amazing images where fungi have been allowed to grow onto the surface of some mineral like apatite. And you can see the grooves that they've etched as they've grown across this surface. So fungi bring across these minerals into organic cycles, but they also play a key role in soil formation by decomposing living matter, or matter that was once living, organic matter. So when a tree falls and all of this wood, this mass of wood is lying there, if it wasn't digested by fungi, then it wouldn't be able to re-enter these cycles of these metabolic cycles in which we live. And so fungi play a really important role in recycling matter and transforming one thing into another. They're metabolically ingenious and can do this in a very gifted and remarkable way. So those are two ways that they help with the formation of soil.
And is it, because this is something when I was reading your book, I became curious about, and this is probably completely nonsensical, but are fungi the only sort of living organism that decompose things, that does this? Are they the only ones who do this? For example, decomposing the tree that has fallen? Are they the only ones who do that? Or are there other non-fungi kingdom living beings that do that as well?
So no, they don't operate alone. They're particularly gifted at decomposition, but bacteria play a very important role, whether free-living bacteria or the bacteria living inside fungi. Fungi have microbiomes just like we do, and they have bacteria that live inside their networks and which allow fungi to do certain things they wouldn't otherwise be able to do. But also, animals, small animals in the soil play a very important part by chomping things into smaller pieces, or by cultivating fungi, like termites, for example, cultivate fungi in their mounds, and they bring chomped up wood to feed the fungus. The fungus decomposes the wood, termites eat the slurry, and much of the wood that's decomposed in the African tropics passes through a termite mound. So you have these interesting collaborations. So animals also play a part. Everyone's working together.
So if we go back a little bit, collaboration between animals and fungi and so on, I'm very interested in what you explained a little bit about in the very beginning, this algae coming onto the shores, on the land and so on, and having fungi actually function as their roots for, I don't know how long, a couple of million years, maybe a couple of tens?
No, like 50, 60 million years.
Oh, wow, 50, 60 million years. And that's something which brings me to, in your book you explain how this idea of relationships between living organisms, right? So where we've come to a new understanding, or we're sort of exploring new insights into the ways in which in nature collaboration works. And it's really interesting. In your book, you kind of take us a little bit on a journey of the history of science in understanding things like parasites, symbiotic relationships, and so on. Could you kind of tell our audience a little bit about that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so fungi have played a really key role in the understanding of cooperation and collaboration in the living world. So lichens are the key players here, the stars of the show. They're kind of symbiotic icons, poster organisms for symbiosis, in fact. In the mid-19th century, the germs, like there was a thing called the germ theory of disease, and when larger organisms shared bodily space with smaller organisms like bacteria, it was assumed that this was one of disease or parasitism. So it was not going to end well. The larger organism was being a host and was being troubled in some way by these smaller organisms. But in lichens, it turned out, as one Swiss botanist observed, that more than one organism seemed to be living together. And he suggested the dual hypothesis of lichens, that lichens were not just a lower plant, as they'd been assumed to be, but were actually a fungus and an alga growing together and doing playing different roles key to the persistence of the overall organism. And he was laughed out of the house because it was impossible for people to come to terms with the fact that you might have what they called a useful and invigorating parasitism. Mm-hmm. So his ideas eventually became adopted because it became clear that that's what was going on. And a biologist called Albert Frank, in his study of lichens, brought into biology a word called symbiosis. Mm-hmm. And symbiosis was a word that he brought into biology to describe the ways that organisms could form relationships that could stretch from parasitism at one pole to mutually beneficial relationships on the other pole. Symbiosis included them all. It didn't presume to understand the dynamics of the exchange. It just could describe in an unbiased way the process of living together. And after this word was coined, then a number of fascinating new symbiotic discoveries were made, like corals, for example, or plants and mycorrhizal fungi. So this was really an important moment. And this obviously had big implications for evolution, because if organisms were living together in this intimate way, creating a shared body, then what did that mean for our understanding of how organisms evolved over long stretches of time. They were not evolving separately from each other, they were evolving in some way together. And so this led on later to the ideas in the 20th century of Lynn Margulis, who was a very visionary and vocal proponent of the ideas that evolutionary novelty in a number of key moments had arisen by the coming together and staying together of unrelated organisms, and what she called the long-lasting intimacy of strangers.
Yeah.
And I think this is a beautiful idea. And what it basically means is that rather than the tree of life being something which just branches and branches and branches, distant branches of the tree can come together and fuse, melt together into an inseparable new lineage. So this really changes our understanding of how life proceeds and what the history of life actually looks like if you were to draw it.
Yeah, but this is the reason why lichen are not necessarily fungi species, but they're also not an algae species, but they're also not a plant species, right? They're a different life form, and you have all kinds of different sorts of lichens, right?
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Yeah, it's a lifestyle.
And one of the things I found also interesting in discovering this whole field of science, I'm not a scientist myself, obviously, but this has been really, and this is maybe something for the audience, another reason to buy and read Merlin's book is it's extremely poetic. I never knew that scientists, biologists could be so poetic and things like long-lasting intimacy between strangers.
Oh, that's Lynn Margulis.
Yeah, I mean, you have a hand of that as well. I mean, you're very. Please read it. It's incredibly rich, poetically speaking, I think. But anyways, one of the things I found really interesting is finding out that these kind of processes, these symbiotic and what is also holobiont assemblages, also relate to our bodies as well, right? So there are foreign strangers with which we form long-lasting intimacies with, right? And maybe you could tell us a little bit about who else inhabits our bodies.
Yeah, so exactly. So the idea of lichens sort of generalized then to all of life, and we're a part of that. So we have bacteria and fungi that live in us and on us, without which we couldn't grow and behave as we do, play crucial roles. In fact, we carry around more microbial cells than our own cells. And this really raises all sorts of interesting questions about individuality. We're not alone. Fungi have bacteria that live inside them. Big bacteria can have small bacteria living inside them. Big viruses can have small viruses living inside them. It really is its relationship all the way down and all the way up. So the question of what is an individual becomes a really fascinating question without a good answer. And it's one of those questions I think that is just good to sit in and be puzzled by. We obviously need to identify individuals for various different reasons, like when we're filling out our passport application forms, it's important to putting our taxes. There are some things it's helpful to be able to identify individuals, but I think what it really does, this question, is make the idea of the individual not a natural fact, but rather a category that depends on our point of view. And I think all sorts of things start to change when we take that on board.
Yeah, I was particularly struck by the realization or the knowledge that some of our immune system functions are actually complemented by the fungi and bacteria in our bodies, so that our ability to survive, to fight off foreign, perhaps disease-carrying viruses or whatever, depend on the cells of other beings. That was a bit of a mind-blowing thing to me. Yeah,
I mean, it's one of the ways in which this starts to change our understanding. The way the immune systems used to be understood is as kind of defensive structures, defensive systems that made sure that the fortress of our bodies stayed unperturbed by all those others out there. But in fact, it seems to be rather that our immune systems have evolved to regulate the populations of microbes that live in us. That actually it's more of a kind of a balancing system than an exclusionary one. So yeah, all sorts of things start to change when we take on these viewpoints.
Listen, Melvin, my time my clock is telling me that we have only a minute left. Can you believe that? Can you believe that? I have a whole list of topics I wanted to go over with you, but 20 minutes are just simply not enough. Maybe to conclude, one of the things that you talk about is what you're calling radical mycology. Can you maybe give us, I don't know, in the last few seconds that we've got, maybe 30 seconds, I don't know, a bit of an insight in what that is, what that means, and what you think it can do for the future?
So mycology, the study of fungi, has been neglected, and for too long it's been impossible to study this in any sort of joined up way within academic institutions, because fungi were not recognized as their own kingdom, so they didn't have a kingdom's worth of attention, a kingdom's worth of professors and students and funding. So for a long time, the study of fungi and has been conducted by passionate amateurs, and amateur in the best sense, amateur from the Latin amo, to love. And so it has, much of science was conducted this way until the mid-19th century, when things started to get more professionalized and departmentalized. But today, the grassroots study of fungi is still bustling and active and growing. And radical mycology is the name given to a kind of grassroots mycological movement by a mycologist called Peter McCoy, who runs an organization called Radical Mycology. And his vision is to empower people who might not have had university training, empower people to investigate fungi, to work with fungi, to cultivate them, to find out new things about fungi, and how we can partner with them in new, interesting ways that might help us adapt to some of the problems that we face.
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting and very exciting ways of where some of that amateur, that passionate, and the science is driven forward by people who are just passionate about knowledge and about, discovery and so on. I think that's really, to me, it feels very promising, where some of that knowledge seeking happens outside of the university, outside of the laboratory, but it's kind of democratized, and it's something that we all can take part of and claim ownership of. I am extremely happy that we were able to have this conversation. I wish we could have had more time, because there's so much we wanted to talk about: intelligence, consciousness, all kinds of exciting things. But our time is up. Merlin, thank you so much for being part of this.
Thank you for having me. It's been wonderful to chat.
Yeah. Maybe we'll have another shot at this one time in the future.
That would be great. Yeah.
Bye. Take care.